The spring of 1935 arrived in Harlem with the kind of damp chill that made people walk faster, heads down, collars up. On the evening of March 12th, outside the Cotton Club on West 142nd Street, the air carried the smell of rain-soaked pavement mixed with cigarette smoke and expensive perfume. Men in tailored suits stood beneath the club's famous awning, their shoes polished to a mirror shine, their hats tilted at angles that suggested both confidence and calculation. This was the border territory where two worlds intersected but never truly merged: the white-owned entertainment palaces that profited from black culture, and the black neighborhoods that surrounded them like a sea around an island. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson stood among a small group of men near the club's side entrance. He was 30 years old, though his face carried the kind of weathered quality that made precise age difficult to determine. He wore a dark suit that fit well but was not ostentatious, and he carried himself with the upright posture of someone who had learned early that how you held your body mattered as much as what you said. In the neighborhood, people had begun calling him Bumpy, a nickname derived from a bump on the back of his head, the result of a childhood injury. He had arrived in Harlem from South Carolina in 1919, part of the Great Migration that reshaped American cities. For 16 years, he had observed, learned, and slowly built relationships in the intricate economy of streets where legitimate business and illicit enterprise existed in constant negotiation. The man who approached him that evening was Dutch Schultz, though everyone present knew him by reputation before they knew his face. Schultz controlled much of the numbers racket in Harlem, the illegal lottery system that allowed working people to bet pennies on three-digit numbers drawn daily. It was an economy that generated millions of dollars annually, and virtually all of it flowed through white-controlled organizations into white-controlled banks and businesses, while black residents provided the customer base and took the legal risks. Schultz was accompanied by 3 associates, all of them moving with the casual authority of men accustomed to deference. The encounter occurred near the club's loading entrance, where the glamour of the main doors gave way to the functional reality of service corridors and trash receptacles. Bumpy had been speaking with 2 local numbers runners about collection routes when Schultz's group arrived. What was said in that moment has been recounted in various forms over the decades, but the essential content remains consistent across sources. Schultz, irritated by the presence of independent black operators who refused to work within his system, addressed Bumpy directly. The specific words varied in different retellings, but the sentiment was preserved. Bumpy was referred to as a street dog, an animal that survived by scraps and should know its place at the bottom of the hierarchy. Bumpy's response, or rather his lack of one, surprised those who witnessed it. He did not raise his voice. He did not move toward confrontation. His face maintained the same neutral expression he had worn before Schultz spoke. He looked at Schultz for a moment, a look that was neither defiant nor submissive, simply observational. Then he turned and walked away from the Cotton Club, moving north on Lenox Avenue with steady, unhurried steps. The 2 numbers runners who had been speaking with him followed after a brief hesitation, uncertain whether they had just witnessed cowardice or something else entirely. What Dutch Schultz did not know, what many people in Harlem were only beginning to understand, was that Bumpy Johnson had spent 16 years studying power. Not the theatrical display of power that came from violence or loud declarations, but the structural mechanics of how control actually functioned in a neighborhood where poverty and resilience existed side by side. He had worked for Stephanie St. Clair, the woman known as Queenie, who had built the most successful black-owned numbers operation in Harlem during the 1920s. From her, he had learned that information was currency, that loyalty was built through consistency rather than fear, and that the white-controlled criminal organizations like Schultz's depended on a system that could be disrupted if one understood its pressure points. The walk from the Cotton Club to the apartment where Bumpy was staying took 15 minutes. He did not speak during this time. The two men who accompanied him later reported that his silence was complete and purposeful, the kind of quiet that precedes significant decisions rather than the quiet of defeat. When they reached the apartment building on 139th Street, Bumpy went inside alone. He spent that night and the following day in that apartment, refusing visitors and giving no explanation for his withdrawal. During those hours of isolation, Bumpy Johnson was engaged in a form of strategic analysis that would define the next phase of his life. The insult from Schultz was not personal, though it had been delivered personally. It was structural. Schultz saw black operators as subordinate, not because of any individual failing, but because the entire system of criminal enterprise in New York City had been organized to maintain that hierarchy. The Italian and Irish mobs controlled importation, distribution, and political protection. They allowed black entrepreneurs to operate only at the lowest levels, street-level collection and retail, while extracting the majority of profits and offering no protection from law enforcement. This system persisted because it appeared unassailable. Schultz had connections to Tammany Hall politicians, to police captains, to judges who could make charges disappear or appear as needed. He had access to capital that allowed him to absorb losses that would destroy a smaller operation. He had a reputation for violence that discouraged competition before it could organize. But Bumpy had observed something that Schultz's confidence prevented him from seeing. The system had become rigid. It depended on predictable arrangements that had not been seriously challenged in years. And rigidity, Bumpy understood, created brittleness. On the morning of March 14th, Bumpy Johnson began a series of meetings that would continue for the next several days. He did not announce a campaign or declare intentions. He simply spoke with specific people, one at a time or in small groups, in apartments and back rooms and church basements across Harlem. The first of these meetings was with Stephanie St. Clair herself, who had been forced into an uneasy arrangement with Schultz after he had used violence and legal harassment to pressure her operation. She was furious but trapped, unable to continue her independent business without risking prison or worse. Bumpy's proposal to her was simple in concept but complex in execution. Rather than competing directly with Schultz's organization, they would create parallel infrastructure that served the same customer base but operated according to different principles. They would guarantee better payouts to winners, a difference of just a few percentage points, but enough to matter to people betting their marginal income. They would ensure that numbers runners kept a larger share of collections, making it financially attractive to switch allegiances. And, most importantly, they would provide something Schultz's organization never offered: genuine protection for the runners and collectors who took the legal risks. The next meetings involved street-level operators, the runners who collected bets, the writers who recorded them, the controllers who managed local territories. Many of these individuals had worked within Schultz's system and harbored resentments they rarely expressed openly. They had seen friends arrested while white bosses remained untouched. They had been cheated out of their shares. They had been treated as expendable. Bumpy did not ask them to join a rebellion. He asked them to make an economic decision. He showed them, with actual numbers written on paper, how much more money they would earn under a different arrangement. He explained how protection would work, not through bribes to police, which Schultz could always outbid, but through community coordination that made arrests more difficult and legally expensive to prosecute. The strategy required capital, and this meant involving legitimate business owners who had been indirectly funding the numbers game through various forms of money laundering and credit extension. Harlem in 1935 contained numerous successful black-owned enterprises, funeral homes, barbershops, restaurants, real estate companies, whose owners understood that the economic ecosystem of the neighborhood included illegal activity, whether they approved of it or not. Several of these business owners had their own grievances with Schultz's organization, which collected protection payments and controlled access to certain wholesale suppliers and commercial properties. Bumpy approached these men with a different proposition. He was not asking for direct financial investment in criminal enterprise. Instead, he proposed a form of community economic defense. If numbers runners and collectors banked their money with black-owned institutions instead of the white-controlled accounts Schultz's organization used, it would create liquidity for legitimate business expansion while simultaneously depriving Schultz of the banking relationships that made his money usable. If commercial property owners refused to renew leases for Schultz's front businesses, it would force his organization to operate from less convenient locations, increasing operational costs and visibility. These business owners were cautious. They had seen what happened to people who defied organized criminal operations. But they were also practical men who understood leverage. Bumpy was not asking them to confront Schultz directly or publicly. He was asking them to make seemingly independent business decisions that, in aggregate, would create systemic pressure. A landlord could refuse to renew a lease for legitimate reasons, building repairs, family use, higher offers from other tenants. A bank could tighten lending requirements or delay transactions due to regulatory concerns. None of these individual actions would appear coordinated, but their combined effect would be significant. The most crucial meetings, however, involved community organizers and church leaders who occupied a different kind of authority in Harlem. These individuals were not involved in illegal activity, but they were deeply invested in the neighborhood's well-being. They had watched the numbers game drain money from families who could not afford to gamble. They had seen the violence that accompanied territorial disputes. They had witnessed how white-controlled criminal organizations treated Harlem as a colony to be exploited rather than a community to be served. Bumpy's pitch to these leaders was built on a frank acknowledgement of reality. The numbers game was not going to disappear. Attempts at moral reform had failed repeatedly because people wanted the hope that gambling offered, however illusory. Given that the activity would continue regardless, the question was not whether it should exist, but who should control it and how those proceeds should be used. Under Schultz's system, money flowed out of Harlem into white-controlled banks and businesses, contributing nothing to the neighborhood beyond employment for low-level runners who absorbed all the legal risk. Under a black-controlled system, even an illegal one, money could be recycled within the community, funding legitimate businesses, supporting families, maintaining buildings. This argument was not universally persuasive. Some church leaders refused any association with illegal activity, regardless of who controlled it. But others, particularly those who worked most closely with the neighborhood's poorest residents, recognized the pragmatic logic. They agreed to a limited form of cooperation. They would not actively support Bumpy's organization, but they would not oppose it either. More importantly, they would mobilize their congregations and community groups to refuse cooperation with Schultz's enforcers. If Schultz's men tried to intimidate runners or business owners, community members would witness and document it. If arrests occurred, church legal funds would provide bail and defense. This was not an alliance with criminality. It was community self-defense against external exploitation. By March 20th, just 8 days after the confrontation outside the Cotton Club, the infrastructure was in place. Bumpy had not attacked Schultz. He had not issued threats or challenges. He had simply created an alternative system and invited people to choose it. The invitation was accompanied by better financial terms, greater safety, and a sense of participation in community self-determination that Schultz's operation could never offer. The first visible effect appeared in collection numbers. Runners who had worked for Schultz's organization began reporting lower takes. At first, this seemed like ordinary weekly variation, the kind of fluctuation that occurred naturally in any gambling operation. But when the pattern continued into the second week, Schultz's lieutenants began investigating. They discovered that many of their regular customers were placing bets with new runners, independents who seemed to have appeared suddenly across multiple neighborhoods. Schultz's response was predictable. He sent enforcers to intimidate the new runners and reassert control. But here, the carefully constructed system revealed its effectiveness. When enforcers arrived at collection points, they found themselves surrounded by witnesses, people standing on stoops, watching from windows, emerging from nearby buildings. No one intervened physically, but the presence of observers made the kind of casual violence Schultz's organization usually employed far more complicated. Beating someone in a public space where dozens of people could provide testimony was legally problematic in ways that beating someone in a private space was not. When enforcers attempted to destroy betting slips or rough up runners, community members called police, not because they expected police to help, but because it created official documentation. In the past, such incidents had gone unreported, making them legally invisible. Now, each act of intimidation generated police reports, witness statements, and bureaucratic records that would complicate any future legal defenses Schultz's organization might need. More significantly, when Schultz's enforcers attempted to pressure business owners who were providing cover for the new runners, barber shops where bets were collected, restaurants where money was counted, they discovered that the usual leverage no longer worked. Property owners claimed lease disputes were in litigation. Bank managers cited new regulatory requirements that made quick cash deposits difficult. Wholesale suppliers explained that their distribution territories had been reorganized. Each explanation was individually plausible, but their simultaneous occurrence suggested coordination that was difficult to prove or confront. Dutch Schultz's organization had operated for years on the principle that overwhelming force and political connections made them untouchable. They had never needed to compete on service quality or economic terms because they had never faced real competition. The sudden appearance of an alternative system exposed a vulnerability they had not anticipated. Their entire business model depended on black community members having no other options. Once options existed, customer loyalty evaporated with startling speed. By early April, Schultz's Harlem numbers operation was losing money. The runners who remained loyal to his organization were collecting less, and the costs of maintaining control, paying enforcers, managing political connections, dealing with increased legal attention, had increased substantially. Meanwhile, Bumpy's parallel system was growing without visible leadership or centralized organization. There was no headquarters to raid, no bank accounts to seize, no business licenses to revoke. The operation existed as a network of individual actors making independent choices that happened to align. Schultz attempted to identify the source of the coordination. His investigators asked questions, offered bribes for information, and tried to trace the money flows. They discovered what everyone in Harlem already knew, but what was useless as actionable intelligence. Bumpy Johnson was involved. But proving this involvement or using it to disrupt the operation was another matter entirely. Bumpy owned no businesses connected to numbers. He employed no runners directly. He had no bank accounts that showed suspicious activity. He simply talked to people. And after those conversations, people made different choices. On April 8th, a meeting occurred that has been documented in multiple sources, though the exact dialogue remains uncertain. Dutch Schultz requested a sit-down with Bumpy Johnson, using intermediaries to arrange it. The location was neutral territory, not Schultz's usual headquarters, but a social club in Midtown Manhattan that served as common ground for various criminal organizations to conduct negotiations. The fact that Schultz requested this meeting rather than simply escalating violence was itself significant. It indicated that he understood the situation had moved beyond what force alone could resolve. What was discussed in that meeting has been described differently by different sources, but the outcome was documented in subsequent actions. Schultz did not concede control of Harlem's numbers game entirely, but he agreed to what amounted to a partition. His organization would continue to operate, but independent black-controlled operations would be tolerated. More significantly, the terms of operation would change across the board. Payout rates would increase to match what Bumpy's system offered. Runners would keep a larger percentage of collections, and the casual violence that had characterized Schultz's enforcement would be scaled back significantly. These changes were not formalized in any written agreement. In the world of illegal enterprise, such arrangements existed as mutual understanding backed by the practical recognition that continued conflict was more expensive than accommodation. Schultz had the resources to continue fighting. But the cost-benefit analysis no longer favored confrontation. He was losing money in Harlem while simultaneously managing conflicts with other criminal organizations across New York. Accepting a compromise freed resources for more profitable disputes. For Bumpy Johnson, the negotiated partition represented something more substantial than a business arrangement. It demonstrated that the seemingly unassailable power of white-controlled criminal organizations could be challenged through systemic strategy rather than direct confrontation. The key had been understanding that power did not reside in individuals, but in systems of mutual cooperation. By creating an alternative system that served the same functions more efficiently and equitably, he had forced a reallocation of control without requiring a single violent confrontation between organizations. The aftermath of this conflict unfolded over subsequent months and years. Dutch Schultz himself was murdered in October 1935, shot in a restaurant in Newark by assassins working for other criminal organizations. His death was unrelated to the Harlem situation. He had made too many enemies across too many territories, but it removed the primary figure who might have attempted to reverse the accommodation. The Italian and Irish mobs that controlled New York's criminal economy continued to operate in Harlem, but they did so with a greater awareness that black community members were not simply passive resources to be exploited. The changes in how the numbers game operated had tangible effects on Harlem's economy. The increased payout rates meant that winners received more money, which circulated within the neighborhood rather than disappearing into external accounts. The higher percentages for runners created a class of relatively well-paid workers who spent their earnings locally. The reduction in casual violence made streets safer and reduced the burden on families who had previously lived in fear of random intimidation. More broadly, the confrontation established a model for how marginalized communities could assert control over their own economic ecosystems. The strategy Bumpy Johnson employed, building parallel infrastructure, coordinating community resistance, creating economic incentives for defection, and imposing systemic costs on oppressive organizations, would be studied and adapted in various forms throughout the civil rights era and beyond. The specific context was illegal gambling, but the principles applied to any situation where external exploitation depended on community powerlessness and disorganization. Bumpy Johnson himself continued to operate in Harlem's underground economy for decades. He formed associations with Italian crime families, particularly the Genovese organization, but always maintained a degree of independence and community connection that distinguished him from pure criminal opportunists. He served multiple prison sentences for various offenses, but each time he returned to Harlem, he found his reputation intact and his authority recognized. This was not because people glorified criminality, but because they remembered how he had demonstrated that even the most entrenched systems of exploitation could be challenged by those willing to think strategically and act collectively. The incident outside the Cotton Club in March 1935 has been retold many times, often with embellishments that obscure the actual historical record. The detail mentioned in the title of this narrative, that a white mob boss was found in a trash can 2 days later, cannot be verified through reliable historical sources and appears to be either embellishment or confusion with other incidents from the era. What is verifiable is that Dutch Schultz's control over Harlem's numbers racket was significantly diminished after his confrontation with Bumpy Johnson, that this diminishment resulted from strategic community organizing rather than direct violence, and that the changes lasted long after Schultz's death. The broader significance of this episode lies not in individual personalities or dramatic confrontations, but in what it revealed about the nature of power in marginalized communities. Schultz's insult, calling Bumpy a street dog, reflected a world view in which hierarchy was natural and permanent, in which some people were born to command and others to obey. This world view was not simply a matter of individual prejudice. It was built into the economic and political structures of American society in the 1930s, which systematically excluded Black Americans from legitimate pathways to prosperity and then punished them for participating in illegal alternatives. Bumpy Johnson's response demonstrated that such structures, while powerful, were not invulnerable. They depended on the acquiescence of those they exploited. When that acquiescence was withdrawn strategically, not through emotional outburst or symbolic protest, but through the patient construction of alternative systems, the structures could be forced to accommodate or collapse. This lesson was learned by other organizers in Harlem and beyond, many of whom had no connection to criminal enterprise but faced similar challenges of confronting entrenched power with limited resources. The economic implications extended beyond the numbers game itself. The recirculation of gambling proceeds within Harlem contributed to the neighborhood's commercial vitality during a period when legal economic opportunities remained severely restricted. Black-owned businesses that received deposits from numbers operations were able to extend credit to other community members, creating a localized financial system that operated parallel to the white-controlled banking sector that systematically discriminated against black borrowers. This was not an ideal situation, relying on illegal gambling proceeds to fund legitimate business development, but it was a pragmatic response to systematic exclusion from conventional financial institutions. The social implications were equally significant. The visible success of community-organized resistance to external exploitation created a sense of collective efficacy that would prove important in subsequent civil rights mobilizations. People who had participated in or witnessed the reorganization of the numbers game understood viscerally that power could be challenged, that coordination could overcome apparent powerlessness, and that victory did not require matching the oppressor's resources if one could change the terms of engagement. This knowledge was not abstract or theoretical. It was embodied in specific memories. The moment when a Schultz enforcer backed down because too many witnesses were present, the week when a favorite runner started offering better odds, the visible presence of community members supporting each other against external threats. These concrete experiences created a collective memory that informed future struggles. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, 3 decades after the confrontation with Dutch Schultz. By the time of his death, Harlem had changed dramatically. The civil rights movement had achieved major legal victories, though economic inequality persisted. The numbers game had been partially supplanted by state-run lotteries that appropriated the business model while channeling proceeds to government rather than community organizations. The Italian and Irish mobs that had dominated mid-century criminal enterprise were in decline, facing federal prosecution under RICO statutes and competition from new ethnic organizations. In retrospective accounts of Harlem's history, Bumpy Johnson occupies a complicated position. He was indisputably involved in illegal activity throughout his adult life. He was not a civil rights leader in the conventional sense, and he made no claims to moral authority or social reform. Yet his strategic intelligence and his commitment to maintaining black control over Harlem's underground economy had effects that extended beyond the criminal sphere. The community infrastructure he helped build, the networks of mutual support he helped coordinate, and the demonstration of strategic possibility he provided all contributed to a broader culture of resistance and self-determination. The fact that this contribution emerged from the context of illegal gambling reflects a harsh reality of American racial history. For much of the 20th century, illegal enterprise was one of the few economic sectors where black entrepreneurs could accumulate capital and exercise substantial control. Legitimate business opportunities were systematically restricted through discriminatory lending, exclusionary zoning, biased licensing procedures, and simple refusal of white business owners to sell to or partner with black buyers. Criminal enterprise, while dangerous and morally compromised, operated outside these formal restrictions. This does not justify or romanticize illegal activity. The numbers game exploited poor people's desperate hope for financial escape, and the violence that sometimes accompanied criminal enterprise caused genuine harm to communities. But understanding the historical context requires acknowledging that the choice was not between legitimate prosperity and criminal enterprise. For many black Americans in the 1930s, the choice was between different forms of exploitation, and retaining some measure of community control over that exploitation was preferable to complete external domination. The transformation that began with a public insult outside the Cotton Club in March 1935 thus represents more than a gangster's rise to power. It represents a moment when strategic intelligence, community coordination, and clear-eyed understanding of systemic mechanics combined to shift the balance of power in a marginalized neighborhood. The victory was neither complete nor permanent. Power in Harlem would continue to be contested through subsequent decades, but it established a precedent and a methodology that would prove relevant far beyond its immediate context. In the decades following Bumpy Johnson's death, scholars and community historians have worked to document the complex economic and social structures of mid-century Harlem. Their research has revealed the extent to which seemingly separate spheres, legitimate business, criminal enterprise, religious institutions, political organizations, and community mutual aid networks were actually deeply interconnected. The numbers game was not a separate underground economy. It was integrated into the broader economic ecosystem of the neighborhood, with money and influence flowing across boundaries that appeared distinct but were actually permeable. This integration meant that changes in one sector rippled through others. When Bumpy Johnson and his associates forced better terms from white-controlled criminal organizations, the increased money that remained in black hands affected legitimate businesses, church fundraising, political organizing, and family stability. These effects were difficult to quantify precisely, but they were real and significant. The confrontation that began with an insult, a white mob boss calling a black man a street dog, ended with systemic change because Bumpy Johnson understood that systems, not individuals, were the proper target of strategic action. Dutch Schultz's personal prejudice was irrelevant. What mattered was the structure of exploitation he represented and the community mechanisms that could be mobilized to restructure that exploitation. The insult was symptomatic of a system that viewed black community members as subordinate by nature. The response demonstrated that subordination was a political arrangement, not a natural fact, and political arrangements could be renegotiated. This understanding that power resides in systems rather than individuals, and that systems can be changed through strategic collective action, would become central to civil rights organizing in subsequent decades. The specific tactics would differ. The civil rights movement relied primarily on legal challenges, mass mobilization, and moral persuasion rather than economic pressure within illegal markets. But the underlying principle was the same. Oppressive systems depend on particular arrangements of cooperation and compliance. Change those arrangements, and the system must adapt or fail. Bumpy Johnson's legacy in Harlem exists in multiple registers. To some residents, he remained a criminal whose activities harmed the community, even as he claimed to protect it. To others, he represented a pragmatic defender who navigated impossible circumstances and ensured that black community members retained some control over their own exploitation. To still others, he was a complex figure who defied simple categorization, someone whose strategic intelligence and community connections produced real benefits despite his participation in harmful activities. What remains clear across these varying assessments is that the confrontation in March 1935 marked a turning point. Before that moment, white-controlled criminal organizations operated in Harlem with near-total impunity, extracting wealth and imposing violence without significant resistance. After that moment, such operations had to negotiate with community-based power structures that could impose costs and create alternatives. The change was not absolute. White-controlled crime did not disappear from Harlem, but it was real and lasting. The methodology that produced this change deserves attention beyond its historical context. Bumpy Johnson did not defeat Dutch Schultz through superior violence or greater resources. He defeated him by building a better system and inviting people to choose it. He identified the pressure points where Schultz's organization was vulnerable: dependence on community cooperation, reliance on rigid hierarchies, assumption of permanent advantage, and applied pressure systematically until the structure adapted. This approach required patience. The transformation took weeks to organize and months to fully manifest. It required intelligence about how power actually operated, not how it appeared to operate. It required coalition building across different community sectors, each with different interests and concerns. It required maintaining strategic focus, even when confronted with provocations that invited emotional response. Most fundamentally, it required understanding that lasting change comes from structural reorganization rather than symbolic victories. The lesson of March 1935 is not that criminal enterprise should be romanticized or that illegal activity serves community interests. The lesson is about the mechanics of power and resistance in contexts where formal equality does not exist and where marginalized communities must create their own leverage through strategic coordination. This lesson has remained relevant across decades and contexts because the fundamental dynamics of exploitation and resistance persist even as their specific forms evolve. When Dutch Schultz called Bumpy Johnson a street dog, he articulated a worldview in which the hierarchy was fixed and natural. When Bumpy Johnson walked away from that insult without visible response, he was not accepting that worldview. He was beginning a process of systematic challenge that would demonstrate its falsity. The quiet walk away from confrontation was not weakness, it was the beginning of strength. The silence was not submission, it was strategic calculation. The restraint was not fear, it was understanding that the battle was not won in moments of emotion, but in weeks of careful construction. That understanding, and the success it produced, became part of Harlem's collective memory. It informed how subsequent generations thought about power, resistance, and possibility. It demonstrated that even under conditions of extreme disadvantage, strategic intelligence and community coordination could shift seemingly immovable structures. It showed that respect could not be given. It had to be built through demonstrated capability and sustained commitment. The man who was insulted outside the Cotton Club in March 1935 died 33 years later, having never held elected office, never founded a legitimate business empire, never received public honors or institutional recognition. But he changed the balance of power in his neighborhood permanently, and the methods he employed continued to instruct organizers and strategists long after his death. That transformation, from public disrespect to structural power, was not accomplished through violence or dramatic confrontation. It was accomplished through patient strategic work, one conversation and one coalition and one small systemic shift at a time, until the accumulated changes made the old order untenable. This is how power actually changes hands, not through moments of theatrical drama, but through sustained strategic pressure applied at vulnerable points until systems reorganize. Not through individual heroism, but through collective coordination that makes individual resistance impossible to isolate and defeat. Not through matching the oppressor's strength, but through changing the field of contest until existing strength becomes irrelevant. That is what happened in Harlem in the spring of 1935. A man was publicly insulted, walked away silently, and spent the next weeks systematically dismantling the power structure that produced that insult. The work was quiet, methodical, and largely invisible to those outside the community, but the results were undeniable and permanent. The system that allowed casual disrespect from white criminals toward black community members never fully recovered its previous dominance. The balance had shifted, and it would never shift back.